Good morning. Thank you. So this is a presentation where I will try to explain to you what the problem is when you perform a recovery of Active Directory, and also at the same time what the solution will be. And also throughout the presentation I will guide you through the number of steps on how to, let's say, step by step to fix this problem, because it's an important problem that needs to be taken into account. So why is this not working? Because it's not on. So my name is Jorge de Almeida Pinto. I'm based in the Netherlands, working for Semperos for 3+ years, focusing on identity recovery and many other things related to scripting, also security. I'm the original writer of the cryptGT password reset script, so any feedback welcome. So let's get started. So this is one of the scenarios, because there's another one, but let's say that this is the scenario we are going to focus on today, is where Entra ID is healthy, everything is fine, there's no problem, and for whatever reason somebody dropped a bomb on your Active Directory, burned to the ground due to, for example, ransomware. You need to recover. What do you do? Let's have a look at the options. A timeline where Entra ID and Active Directory are initially obviously happy together. Somebody dropped a bomb on your Active Directory and it's ransomware, it's down. You have to recover. What are your options? Let's say that you have a backup of yesterday, your most recent backup. And when you look at the gauge above, you will see that the so-called security state posture is in the red zone. In other words, it's not that good. The other option is you have a backup that's 10 days old. The 10 is just an example, for which the security posture appears to be in the green zone. In other words, a little bit better. Which one do you choose? Well, first of all, you have to ask yourself, how do you even know what the security posture is of your Active Directory when just having a look at the backup? Unless you have performed a security scan before taking that backup and then reporting it somehow and telling you, hey, this is good or bad, etc. In other words, you don't know. But then again, from my perspective, it's not even important to understand what the security posture is of your Active Directory within a certain backup. And I will explain why. Because when you perform a recovery, going back to production consists of two phases. The first phase is obviously recovering the Active Directory, making sure it's up and running again. And the second stage is securing it. But before being able to secure it, you have to perform a security assessment to understand what is wrong, what is bad, categorized in 3 lists: short, mid, and long-term actions. Obviously the short-term actions are the ones that you need to take into account and do as soon as possible before going back to production. So regardless which backup, you have to perform the security assessment, no matter what. But then again, the question still remains, which backup do you choose? Do you choose the one from yesterday, where you only have these set of changes? So this is the delta between, for example, today and yesterday when the backup was taken? Or do you choose the backup that is 10 days old, for which the changes are obviously more? And when you look at the slides, you will see that it's about not just about the changes between the recovered AD and, let's say, the AD of today just before the ransomware, but it's also about the changes between the recovered AD, whichever it is, and any other system interacting with Active Directory, including Entra ID itself. So the further you go back in time, the more headaches you will have. Because think about the following. If you go back in time, using a backup of 10 days ago, you have an Active Directory state that might not include, for example, servers, applications, service accounts that were created after that backup. Suddenly those systems stop working. The same applies with Entra ID. There's a huge gap. That gap needs to be closed. In other words, the larger the gap, the more headaches you will have in closing that gap, because you don't only have to interact with Active Directory itself, you have to interact with all kinds of other systems interacting with Active Directory. So you have to go outside of AD, which is even more work and more difficult. You may even need to have to interact with other teams, which makes it even maybe a lengthier process. The security, although the one on the right appears to be less good compared to the one on the left, in my opinion, is not important. You still have to perform the security assessment. And you still have to fix whatever needs to be fixed. And all the stuff that you need to fix is AD focused. So it's centralized. And it's maybe under your control. And if it's under your control and centralized, it's easier to fix. What are things that you can think of? For example, ransomware. I always disable all admin accounts, create new ones. The default permissions groups, clean everything out. And those are just a few examples of things that we do by default. And obviously it also depends on whatever comes out of the security assessment, because customers did whatever they did within their AD. In other words, no matter which backup you should choose, no matter what the situation is, you should always choose the most recent backup, no matter what. Because the more changes you have to deal with by the backup that you choose, the more headaches that you will have. The end conclusion in this case would be, and also my opinion, is to keep the gap as small as possible, because it will be the least of your headaches. What's the problem? Either way, choosing one or the other backup, there's still a problem. It's just how big is that problem? Normally, Active Directory is syncing happily with Entra ID. Everything is fine. Now look at the users and the groups at both systems. 4 groups, 4 users in AD, 4 users, 4 groups in Entra ID. And you also even have a few deleted objects, but everything is in sync. Active Directory is ransomware. You have to do something. You have to recover. But before you start recovery, you have to do one important thing, because there's a sync between AD and Entra ID. And that thing is to disable the synchronization. Make sure to disable the synchronization, because you don't want that as soon as the synchronization detects that AD is back up and running again, it starts synchronizing immediately, because that's where it will hurt. So you have to disable sync. You have recovered your Active Directory, and then when you look carefully at the slides, you will see that the recovered AD is missing group 1, user 1, group 3, user 3. And user and group 5 are suddenly back again. When you look at the groups 1 and 3 and also the users, that means that those objects were created after the backup. That's why they don't exist in the backup. And number 5, group 5 and user 5, those were deleted after the backup. That's because after the recovery of the backup, those are back again. Now, if you had not turned on not turned off synchronization, or if you now suddenly turn on synchronization, this is what will happen. Look at the right. The absence of the objects in your Active Directory will cause the deletion in Entra ID. And obviously for group 5 and user 5, re-establish the creation of those objects. So in this case, it's not a deletion that occurred in your AD, no, it's the absence of the objects that will cause the deletion. And the system thinks it is a deletion that caused all this, which is not the case. It's just a different scenario. And because of this, you will shoot yourself in the foot. You will lose your own data. And for users that are happily working, obviously not working against your Active Directory or systems connected to your Active Directory, but talking about systems connected to Entra ID, they are working, and suddenly out of nothing, they can't work anymore. Because, for example, those users were impacted because they were created or provisioned after the backup. Suddenly they can't work anymore using whatever system or application that is connected to Entra. And how long does it take? Well, how long does it take for those users to be able to work again? Well, it really depends on how fast you are able to fix all this and resynchronize. Depending on the size of your environment, the synchronization might take hours. And for some organizations, even days, because you have to resync everything. So you have to be very careful with this scenario and determine how big the problem is before doing anything. And regarding the object that is being recreated again, suddenly you have an object in Entra, which also will have a password. And suddenly that object could be misused if that person is able to log on again remotely. So it could be a security issue. What is the solution? Well, let's look at the state from Entra ID, which is, for example, today in the recovered Active Directory. And as you can see, there's a difference. Where Active Directory normally, at least normally in this scenario, is the authoritative system and Entra ID is the non-authoritative system, when you look at the timeline, it doesn't match. Entra ID suddenly knows more than the authoritative system itself. And that's not the right thing. It should be the other way around. But to make sure that it is the other way around, you have to fix it yourself. It won't happen automatically. So what do? The key thing is to prevent objects in Entra ID from being deleted because of the absence of the objects. As I mentioned, Entra ID knows more than AD, so you ask Entra ID, you perform a query where you ask Entra ID for all the hybrid objects, give me all of them. Users, groups, contacts, and computers. And then for all 4 object types, you check against Active Directory which ones exist, which ones do not exist. And obviously the ones that do not exist in AD, those are the ones that you need to pay attention for. And you do that by recreating them. Just recreating them. And then, is recreation enough? No, that's not enough. You also had to add some glue to it. And the glue is the so-called immutable ID. The immutable ID is let's call a shared attribute between AD and Entra ID that connects those objects together. Entra ID will be able to tell you what that immutable ID is, and then after recreation of that object in AD, you populate that immutable ID, you have applied the glue, and then those objects will happily sync together. Because if you turn on the synchronization, instead of deleting, they will be relinked together again, as if nothing happened. This is the goal that you want to achieve. So, moving forward, let's go back a little also and discuss authentication mechanisms. If you have a cloud-only environment, you're obviously using native authentication, all fine, nothing to do here. However, in a hybrid scenario, you have 3 options. And the 3 options are password hash synchronization. You're basically synchronizing password hashes from AD to Entra ID. Is there a dependency? No, there is no dependency with Active Directory. If Active Directory is down, everything will happily work and continue to work in Entra. You won't be able to provision new users. Those will have to wait, but every existing user will be able to continue to work and do whatever they need to do within Entra and any other system connected to Entra. Some organizations in the past chose the usage of pass-through authentication. In my view, pass-through authentication I call mini ADFS, mini federated authentication. Because with PTA, when Entra receives a authentication request, it basically redirects the authentication request to that agent, and then the agent authenticates the user to Active Directory, and then the whole thing goes back again to Entra, and Entra does whatever it needs to do. But as you can see, when AD is down, there is no authentication provider. So because of that, the whole authentication fails. There's, in other words, a heavy dependency in Active Directory. AD down, if you're using PTA, then your whole authentication mechanism against Entra is also down. Why did people choose this mechanism? The main reason is that they chose this because some security officer said, oh, I don't want to have any passwords in the cloud because that's insecure. It's a valid reason for many, many years ago, because those people were never thinking about what if things go wrong? What if AD goes down? What then? Or ID never goes down. Because all these mechanisms exist already more than 10 years ago, before attacks, ransomware or became the normal thing. And now they are the normal thing. It's a default thing happening every day against many organizations. So you have to take downtime into account. You also need to be resilient. You need to be able to counter that attack and do whatever it needs to be done to first recover, secure, but also be able to get the punch and still continue to work. The other one is federated authentication. Most of the organizations use ADFS, but they also might be using ping federate, ping 1, ping whatever, something else, Okta maybe. Same story is true. There's a heavy dependency on Active Directory. AD down, or even ADFS, because most of the times anything in a ransomware scenario, anything connected to AD also most of the times goes down, including ADFS. So AD down, there's no authentication, it's game over. Are there ways to, let's say, prepare yourself for this if you're using the second and the third scenario? Yes, there is. Where at the first scenario you were primarily using PHS as the authentication mechanism, with the last two scenarios, if you use PHS in the background, synchronizing those hashes, when the bad times come for both scenario 2 and 3, I will explain it later, you just switch the authentication mechanism and Entra, and you can continue to work. With the second one, it's a weird one, because as I mentioned, people chose that. Oh, I don't want to have the passwords in the cloud. But the solution to get out of this is to have the passwords in the cloud. It contradicts each other. But then again, what is your best choice? If you don't have the passwords in the cloud, you won't be able to do anything until you're back again. So choose wisely. When Active Directory is down, let's look at it from a synchronization perspective. If we are talking about connecting, because when we're talking about synchronization, we have two solutions that will help us. Connect Sync, which is the on-prem solution, and also Cloud Sync, the cloud-based solution from Microsoft. Basically, Microsoft wants everybody to move to Cloud Sync in time. So if Connect Sync is still running, as soon as you think about performing the AD recovery, and if AD is down, then the choice is really easy, you have to recover. One of the things that you do is disable the synchronization scheduler on those on-prem machines. What you should not do is disable synchronization as a whole in Entra. Because if you disable synchronization as a whole in Entra, you're basically telling Entra ID, convert all the hybrid identity systems from, all the hybrid identities from hybrid to native. And when that happens, all the data that was synchronized from AD to Entra ID is going to be destroyed because it's not needed anymore. And that's exactly the same data that will help you get out of this problem. So disabling as a whole is not a good idea. Don't do it. Disable the scheduler instead. For Cloud Sync, when AD is down, different mechanism, different solution. The problem is still the same, is you have to disable synchronization. Imagine you have forest with 10 domains. Then with this one, you would see 10 configurations. You would have to disable all 10 of them, because every configuration in Entra ID for Cloud Sync represents a domain in a specific forest. So you have to disable all 10 as shown on screen on the right. And important is that you might think, oh, let's maybe delete the configuration. Don't delete it. Well, at least not yet. I will talk about this later. Don't delete it. Authentication. As I mentioned before, if you're using PHS, there's no problem. It will continue to work as if nothing happened. With PTA, by the way, it will hurt. If you don't have PHS in the background running, or if you didn't have it running in the background, in other words, those passwords are, not the password, but the hashes are already in the cloud, then it will hurt. You won't be able to do anything until AD is down. Well, technically that's not entirely true, because the thing that you're missing is a password. So you could, for example, provision passwords for everyone, but then what are you going to do? Are you going to give everyone welcome 2025 and then distribute it? How are you going to distribute it? Through email? Well, they need access to email, so it becomes a headache. It's not impossible, but let's say it's also not pretty. Just make sure you have PHS in the background running. What do you do if you do have PHS in the background running? You have to convert the authentication mechanism by telling Entra, stop redirecting using PTA, start using native authentication. And for that you have to download the agent, start the installation. Just start the installation. By doing so, the PowerShell modules become available. and then you use the PowerShell module to disable PTA in the cloud, and then when that happens, Entra ID will natively take over authentication, and then everything works as if nothing happened. With ADFS, by the way, federated authentication, same story. No PHS, it will hurt. However, if you do have PHS in the background, like PTA, you have to do some work. This is more work and it will take more time. Because when using federated authentication, you are using a federated domain, or maybe even multiple federated domains in Entra. Before Entra ID takes over authentication, every single domain needs to be native. In other words, you have to convert the federated domain from federated to native, and that will take time. The time that it takes depends on the amount of objects. So let's say if you have 5,000 objects, well, it doesn't take that much time, but if you have thousands and thousands of objects because your organization is huge, it will take time. And then after the fact, when everything is done, you have to make a choice. What are you going to do? I'm going to keep using PHS, or am I going to move back to PTA, or maybe again federated authentication with PHS in the background? My recommendation to you is keep it as simple as possible. Use PHS as the main authentication mechanism for Entra ID. Save yourselves all the trouble of all the steps that you have to do in addition if you are attacked maybe again in the future. You never know. Connect sync. What do you do? If it's down, you need to rebuild it. So I was talking about a scenario where connect sync is available, but now let's assume it's down. Do you have an export? Do you have a backup to restore that system? Because natively, if you do the next Phyllis installation and you use the default configuration, you could be in luck. But if you have heavily customized it and the customization is mainly on the so-called synchronization rules, do you have that export to reproduce that configuration? There are multiple things. The synchronization rules are not just the only thing that you need to worry about. You have to tell Connect Sync which OUs to sync from. Where do you get that information? Well, you query Entra ID. This is all about if you don't have any export or don't have any backup. What do you do? Query Entra ID for all the hybrid objects, and then check for every hybrid object against AD if those objects exist. And for all the ones that exist, you get a huge list and you create the parent of the parent object where they exist, and that gives you a so-called best effort list of OUs. Like I said, it's best effort. Which features, sync status, everything. The information is visible in Entra. It's just not exposed easy to you. For example, you could use AD internals from Dr. Azure AD, and by using those tools, you could extract the information. Then you know more which features were enabled or were disabled. But now let's talk about the synchronization rules again. When you look at the first three options, I explained to you how to, let's say, reproduce that data if something goes wrong. The fourth one, the synchronization rules, that's not possible. Only the sync engine itself knows it. So if you don't have an export or a backup, you have a serious problem, unless you were using the defaults. But then again, between the versions, you might have different default configurations. So the message here, make sure to always have an export and therefore a backup of your Connect Sync server, and store that backup in a secure location. The beauty of it is that the sync server itself already creates a backup on a daily basis. It's sitting there. It's an export. It's sitting there on the server itself. The only thing that you have to do is get it off that server, put it somewhere safe, and basically hope never to use it. But then if you have to use it, at least you have something. The immutable ID. The immutable ID, as I mentioned before, is the glue between the objects in AD and Entra ID. Where you get that from, which one? Maybe you're using something default, maybe you're using something custom, you don't know. But again, using AD internals, you are able to determine which one was being used. Or if the system is still up for whatever reason, you could get the information from that system yourself. Now, regarding the immutable ID, there's one thing that you need to remember. Many moons ago, when Microsoft released Connect Sync, they used the AD object GUID as the immutable ID value. And if you go back a few slides ago where I explained to you that you have to put the immutable ID onto the object that you have recreated, that's something that you must be able to do. However, when you look at the object GUID is a system-owned attribute. And when it's a system-owned attribute, you cannot manipulate it in any way. So you create a new object, it gets a new object GUID. You can't change it to the old one. In other words, if you have to recover and you're still using the object GUID, you have to perform that migration step from object GUID to the MSDS consistency GUID. The MSDS consistency GUID is an attribute in AD on objects that give you the ability to put in whatever value you want. That's exactly what you need if you get the value from Entra and you have to repopulate it on the newly created object. When you're performing the migration, and if you're using federation, the wizard will do this for you, because it needs to be also changed in the so-called claimed rules within ADFS. If you're not using the wizard or some other third-party federation system, you have to do this manually. One of the things to remember is make sure that these steps, if you're still using the object GUID, that these steps are already done before any attack, before any recovery, because you will still need to do it eventually. Make sure to do it as soon as possible if you're still using this. And obviously at the end, the Connect Sync server will always ask you, hey, do you want me to enable synchronization? The answer is always no. You have to fix stuff first before enabling synchronization. Looking at the synchronization, at least for Connect Sync servers, I looked at all 4 object types: users, groups, contacts, and computers. And in a normal scenario, this works perfectly. But like I said, I also like to look at the scenarios, but what if it goes wrong? What happens then? And then I found these, let's say, call it misconfigurations. And this, what I found here, by the way, is based on a default configuration. So if you have customized your configuration in terms of synchronization rules for Connect Sync, evaluate what you see on screen and also how you would need to change whatever you have to make sure that everything works. So this is based on a default configuration, because I also know that many have all kinds of custom stuff in their synchronization server. So this is for the users. This is what I found that was missing, wrong, or misconfigured. When we look for groups, this is what I found. Well, not something drastic, but it was missing. Looking for contacts, well, I don't know why this was so wrong, but this is what is missing. This is what's wrong. Quite a lot of few things. Contacts might not be the most important objects, but if it is for you, look at this one. And this is for computers, same story. Also all kinds of things that were missing. Now the gap analysis. How do you perform the gap analysis? You ask Entra ID, give me all the hybrid objects. Entra ID has both hybrid, everything synced from AD for example, but also native objects. I don't care about the native objects because those are native, those are already managed by Entra ID. I care about the hybrid ones that came from Active Directory. And I need to query Entra ID, give me all the hybrid objects, so that I can ask AD what is missing. The thing to think about is, but how do I ask AD what is missing? I need to look for something. And when you look at the synchronization, many of the attributes are being synchronized from AD to Entra ID. What do you use? Well, there are a few key attributes that you could use. One is the distinguished name, the object GUID, and the object SID. The distinguished name would be perfect, but only user objects have it. Groups, contacts, computers don't have it, so almost useless. The GUID, it doesn't tell me anything, but when you look, for example, at the distinguished name, it tells you the OU and the domain, it tells you everything. is basically what I want. The GUID is, again, like I said, it's just a number. It doesn't tell you which forest, which domain. It doesn't, nothing. It's let's say if there's really nothing left, you could use it. But again, there's more. Looking at the object SID, that's the perfect one. Because the object SID contains of two parts. It contains the domain part and it contains the object part, the RID, the relative identifier. And the domain part is the part that tells you in which domain the object should exist or be recreated in. There's only one exception: contexts don't have a SID. So you still have to use the GUID in that case, because there's really nothing else that you can use. So by using that information, you will be able to query Active Directory. Hey, are these objects existing or non-existing? And the ones that are not existing, you recreate with the information that you have. One of the things to keep in mind is when you are going to recreate the objects, it's not about completely recovering the object. That is not the intention, because you will not be able to completely recover the object. You are only recreating it, let's give it a name, a so-called placeholder, to prevent a deletion in Entra. Because Entra doesn't know all the information that you need, because when you synchronize to Entra, all those attributes that are synchronized to Entra are based on the synchronization rules. And the synchronization rules might sync a number of attributes, might not sync others. There might be filters. So it is not complete. Again, it's just to recreate it as a placeholder, and anything that is missing needs to come from HR system, identity management system, something else. But when you recreate the objects, you have to ask yourself a few things. When you look at the users in Entra, were they users in AD or INET org persons in AD? Really? 5 minutes? You have to look at the objects. Which one was it? The same for the group types. Which group type was it? AD knows 3 group types: global, local, and universal. Cleaning up is very tricky because, like I said, there might be filters that for which data is not being synchronized to Entra ID. So you need to be careful about those. Cleaning up might be that you're shooting yourself in the foot. Fixing relationships, same story. Whatever Entra knows, you have to reproduce in Active Directory. What Entra doesn't know, it doesn't mean you have to clean it up in AD, because it's very tricky, because of, for example, filters. Where do you get the immutable ID from? Well, it is exposed for users, but not for the object types. But however, using the DirSync API, you will be able to gather the information to repopulate the attribute in AD. One of the downsides of using AD internals to get that data is that Windows Defender unfortunately considers it as malware. So you would need to exclude the folder that you have AD internals on so that you can use it, or just pick out the functions that you need to do that. Let's skip this one. After fixing everything, basically what you need to do is perform tests. Is everything correct as it should be? Are there going to be deletions expected? Just out of interest, how much time did I have? Wasn't it 45 minutes? Okay, because I'm surprised the time's already over. Okay. You have to look at, are there anything that's going to be deleted? And unchanged is good. You might have changes, but then you have to ask yourself, is it expected or not? After synchronizing everything within the sync engine itself, you have to look what the outcome is. Are there pending export deletes, adds, or updates? The adds are things that are going to be recreated. The deletes are the tricky ones. Is that expected? If it's not expected, don't export. Because when you perform the export, everything is going to be export. The so-called updates, it could be changes, are changes to attribute, but what is the change? A replacement, a recreation, or a deletion of some attribute value. With small environments, this is easy to do using the GUI. However, if you have a very large environment, then you have to use some automation. Then you can use this tool that you can find on GitHub to perform an analysis and create a report in different styles: HTML, XML, Excel. And as you can see, it provides you the current value and the new value, and then you can determine, are there differences? This was Connect Sync. Let's have a look at Cloud Sync. Cloud Sync, you cannot perform all those so-called checks that I was talking about. It's basically an on or off thing. There's nothing in between. So before turning it on, you configure the threshold to 1, meaning if there's at least one deletion, stop the synchronization. Don't even continue, not even with that deletion. After enabling the configuration, then you restart. The restart of the synchronization is do a full sync, everything. Be patient and pray everything is okay. Because, like I said, you have all kinds of checks in Connect Sync and then evaluate to continue or not. With Cloud Sync, that's not the case. Is it going to be okay? No. Even if I had fixed everything and I did everything perfect by the book, you will still see this email come in saying, hey, this X amount of objects, more than one, are going to be deleted. And in this case, I had deleted 12, but I fixed therefore 12 users, 12 groups, and 12 contacts. That's why you see the 36. And these are the things, the objects that I listed. If I had continued the synchronization, all these 36 would still be deleted. As I mentioned, even though I did everything by the book. What is the solution? There's a behavioral difference. Where Connect Sync allows you to connect the object to the existing one in Entra, Cloud Sync does the other way around. It first deletes and then tries to fix it. Well, that's a little bit weird. If it's a user, it will be soft deleted, meaning you can undelete it again. If it's a group, it's hard deleted, gone forever. Recreation means you have to recreate also the purpose for that group, or configure it, by the way. What is the solution here? For whatever reason, Cloud Sync remembers the state of those old objects. So I found out, delete the configuration, Cloud Sync, but before deleting it, create a backup. Not manually. Through PowerShell, for example, create a backup of the whole configuration. Then delete it, then restore that configuration again. As if you are reintroducing a complete new configuration. And then with that, the whole state is lost. And that's exactly what you want, because it will then treat every single object as if it's new and re-glue everything back together magically. Don't forget to configure the threshold 1, because there might still be mistakes for something that you forgot. Passwords. Users, while in this whole scenario, users might have changed their password. Check in Entra, in the log that's mentioned on screen, to see which users changed their password. And then contact those users, because as soon as AD is going to take over again, you might have a mismatch, and then people will be calling the service desk, obviously. Recommendations. Be prepared for this. It saves you time, it saves you headache, and a lot of work, because doing this manually, it's almost impossible. It's too much work. Don't think only about AD. Think about everything that interacts with AD or works with AD. ADCS, Connect Sync, Cloud Sync, ADFS, everything. Think about everything around AD. It's not just about AD itself, because today it's a complete ecosystem. Think about everything that you can do if something goes wrong to mitigate any further risk, to mitigate any further damage on systems. If you can control that, there might be less damage, if the scenario obviously fits. But also post actions. Think about performing the security assessments. Therefore, the gap analysis also. Is there a gap between AD and anything else? In this case, Entra. As I mentioned multiple times already, make sure to use PHS. That's the one that's going to save your behind if your Active Directory goes down. If you're using something else, it will hurt momentarily or until literally everything is back up and running again, and that might take some time. If you haven't migrated to Object GUID yet, to the MSDS Consistency GUID, then make sure to do so as soon as possible. And automate as much as possible. Automation is the key here. Make sure to have backups for everything that needs to be restored when needed so. Any questions?
Thank you, George. Scary talk, but super interesting. So we have 2 questions. The first one is, how do you convince clients to choose the more recent but less secure version during a recovery? In my experience, management always chooses the safer option.
Well, I'm going to assume that the so-called safer option is to do with the security state of AD. I know it's a tough talk, because also if you're working with security companies, they will very likely say, choose the most secure one. It might also be the one that's, for example, 2 months ago. Imagine 2 months of changes between back then and now. All kinds, and if you have the choice, let's say from 2 months ago and the one from yesterday, think about all those changes in between. Everything that is missing, all that stuff will break. Security in this case, in my opinion, is not the most important part. It's also the impact on the organization itself. Security is important, but that's the part that I can fix in an isolated environment. Because think about it, when you perform a recovery, you are not going back to production immediately. You have to assess the security and fix it. And that's the moment then you will fix the security to an acceptable level, because you won't be able to fix everything. But then you also have the least changes between the backup and now.
Thank you. The other question is there a resurgence of an on-prem AD? I was under impression AD is fading out.
I understand this question is AD dead? Well, Microsoft obviously wants everybody to move from AD to Entra ID, because Entra ID is the shiny new toy that everybody wants and needs and wants to use. However, Active Directory is in place for many years already, about 20, well, it became 25 this year, but it's not going anywhere. Why? Many large organizations are still using it. And before they have transitioned to the cloud, if they're even going to completely transition to the cloud, it will take years, because they have a complete infrastructure based on AD on-prem, and they're going to migrate everything gradually to the cloud. If you're a small shop, I can imagine that they want to lose Active Directory. I hope this answers the question.
Okay, thank you very much.